When it happened, it was considered the worst fishing-related disaster in New Brunswick in over 100 years. And today, it is still considered one of the worst natural disasters ever for that province. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, a podcast now in its second year from the Weather Network in Canada. So today, we look back at the events of June 20th, 1959, this day in weather history. Of course, I am referring to the 1959 Escuminac disaster. On the 19th, it was estimated the storm intensified into a hurricane about halfway between Bermuda and Nova Scotia, but it was short-lived because 6 hours later it became extratropical. And with that, the remnants of what once was a hurricane struck Atlantic Canada, first in Nova Scotia, and then it plowed its way through the Maritimes and then into Newfoundland before finally dissipating on June 21st. It developed out of an actual Atlantic hurricane that had gone extratropical by this point. It was the third named storm of the season, and it had already done its typical hurricane damage and flooding. It first developed as a tropical wave in the central Gulf of Mexico on the 18th, and then it headed rapidly northeastward and struck Florida later that day. Now, before the storm actually reached the shores of Atlantic Canada, the meteorological branch of the Department of Transport provided notices for the advancing storm. On the day of the storm, the initial forecast from the Halifax Weather Office was for light winds, and although it was amended to highlight the severe conditions about to strike, boats in the region had no radio to learn of the threat. And because of that time of the year, there were many salmon that had already started running through the region. That, of course, prompted the fishermen to set sail. Before they set sail, the weather forecast was for one event. While they were out to sea, the forecast had changed. As the storm approached, there were about 45 boats that were all sailing through the Northumberland Strait between New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island. And they had no way of knowing about the approaching storm. And then June 20th happened. Welcome to year 2 of this podcast. Right now, you're listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider. But there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective. But oftentimes, they will include visuals from that day's event from when it happened in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. The storm slowed and turned sharply to the northwest. It weakened slightly before moving ashore in Canso, Nova Scotia. Crossing the island, it hit PEI before abruptly hooking east and going back through Nova Scotia one more time. Later that day, in weather history, it re-entered the Atlantic Ocean and continued east-northeast. The now extratropical storm moved over southeastern Newfoundland and finally broke up and dissipated on June 21st. Elsewhere throughout the Canadian Maritimes, in New Brunswick, the storm disrupted communications near the coast. Along the coasts of New Brunswick and PEI, high waves destroyed cottages and forced some families to evacuate. The former hurricane-strong wind gusts hit as high as 120 kilometers per hour at times, and the relatively slow movement of the low brought close to 110 millimeters of rain to Nova Scotia. There, boats were literally removed from their moorings, and many lobster cages were smashed beyond repair. The days that immediately followed the storm were grim, to say the least. The Royal Canadian Air Force and the RCMP operated search and rescue missions where families waited helplessly on the beach. The Canadian Red Cross set up headquarters in Escuminac to assist the victims. Artist Claude Roussel created a wood sculpture entitled Les Pêcheurs, The Fishermen, which won first prize at the New Brunswick Museum in 1962. Later, residents near Escuminac raised money to turn the work into a stone monument, which was dedicated on June 19, 1969. It is a beautiful, permanent tourist attraction which depicts a group of fishermen working together with the names of the deceased on a bronze plaque. And then in 2001, the government of New Brunswick declared the Escuminac Disaster Monument as a provincial historical site, commemorating the tragic horror that marks this day in weather history. You know, the easiest way to remind yourself to listen to This Day in Weather History is to subscribe or follow us, and there's a button indicating that right on whatever podcatcher you happen to be listening to us on. Click that button and immediately you're reminded each day. And while you're listening, feel free to rate and review. That way, you're a part of the program as well. Tomorrow is June 21st, and for this one, we go back just a short time ago to 2018, but to a brutal wildfire that was started by nature itself. The Comstock Lake Fire was discovered on June 21st and was caused by lightning on this day in weather history. With me, your host, Chris May.